The town of Oak Ridge did not just have a history, it had an architecture of expectations. At the absolute apex of that architecture stood the Rutledge family. For 3 generations, to bear the name Rutledge was to be synonymous with civic authority, pristine legal practice, and an unspoken, ironclad standard of perfection. The family mansion, a sprawling colonial structure known as the Pillars, sat on a hill overlooking the town, its white columns gleaming like teeth against the dark, manicured pines. Inside the Pillars, dinner was never merely a meal, it was a court performance. Brooke Rutledge sat at the long mahogany table, her thumbs unconsciously tracing the calluses on her palms. She was 27, but in this room, she felt both ancient and invisible. To her left sat her older brother, Blake, his hair perfectly coiffed, his silk tie immaculate. Blake had recently been made a senior partner at Rutledge & Associates, the family's prestigious law firm. Across from her was her younger sister, Chloe, whose recent engagement to Charles Vane, the heir to an old money-banking fortune, had cemented the family's social supremacy for another generation. At the head of the table sat Eleanor Rutledge. Eleanor didn't speak loudly, she didn't have to. Her disapproval was a climate condition, a sudden drop in barometric pressure that everyone in the room instinctively adjusted for. "Brooke, darling," Eleanor said, her fork hovering precisely an inch above her porcelain plate. "Mrs. Sterling mentioned she saw your truck parked outside the old municipal scrap yard yesterday. Again, she asked me if we were having financial difficulties." Blake let out a short, sharp chuckle. "Don't worry, Mother. I told Charles's family that Brooke is just doing her civic duty by keeping the local towing companies in business." "It's a 1974 Chevrolet C10, Brooke said softly, her voice steady despite the familiar tightening in her chest. "I'm restoring the transmission. It belongs to Mr. Finch down at the hardware store." "A mechanic," Eleanor sighed, closing her eyes for a brief, suffering moment. "A Rutledge woman with grease under her fingernails. We gave you an education at Vassar, Brooke. We expected you to use your mind, not a wrench." Arthur Rutledge, Brooke's father, didn't look up from his prime rib. He merely grunted in agreement, his silence a shield he used to protect his own peace within Eleanor's domain. "Value isn't always found in a courtroom, Mother," Brooke said, her eyes fixed on her plate. "Value is found in legacy, Brooke," Blake countered, his voice dripping with the condescension he usually reserved for opposing counsel. "It's found in assets, reputation, and structure. What you do isn't a career. It's a symptom of a refusal to grow up." Brooke looked around the table. She saw Blake's smug certainty, Chloe's delicate, performative pity, and her parents' profound disappointment. For years, she had tried to fit into their mold. She had tried the corporate internships, the charity galas, the polite society small talk. But every hour spent in that world felt like drowning in slow motion. She belonged where things were broken, where the problem was tangible, and where honesty was measured in whether an engine turned over or it didn't. She reached into her coat pocket, her fingers brushing against a folded piece of heavy parchment, a certified cashier's check and a deed transfer. She had made a decision. It was a decision that would either be her liberation or her social execution. Chapter 2, The Sunday Verdict. The announcement happened after the dessert plates were cleared. The air in the dining room was thick with the scent of espresso and expensive vanilla. "I've bought a property," Brooke said, her voice cutting through Blake's monologue. "About his latest corporate acquisition." The table went quiet. Chloe paused, her coffee cup halfway to her lips. "A property," Eleanor repeated, her eyebrows arching slightly. "Well, I suppose it's time you moved out of that apartment." "Is it one of the townhouses near the country club? I believe the Sterling estate is selling a few units." "No," Brooke said. She reached into her pocket, withdrew the deed documents, and laid them flat on the mahogany table. "It's the old Texaco station on Route 9. The one near the bypass." A silence descended upon the room, not a peaceful silence, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that precedes a lightning strike. Blake was the first to break it. He leaned forward, squinting at the document, and then burst into a loud, unbridled laugh. "The old Miller station, the one that's been boarded up since the mid-80s. Brooke, that place is an environmental hazard. It's a literal dump. The roof is half collapsed." "The structure is sound," Brooke said, keeping her eyes level. "The foundation is poured concrete, 4 inches thick. The tanks were drained and certified neutral in 1989. I checked the environmental registry myself." "With what money?" Arthur asked, his voice suddenly sharp, his legal mind snapping into focus. "My savings," Brooke said. "Every cent I made from the restoration contracts over the last 5 years. $45,000. Eleanor stood up. The movement was so sudden, so devoid of her usual calculated grace, that her chair scraped harshly against the hardwood floor. "You spent your entire life savings on an abandoned, derelict piece of roadside garbage. Without consulting us. Without consulting your brother. It's my money, Mother. It is our name," Eleanor hissed, her voice dropping to a fierce, venomous whisper. "You are a hopeless failure, Brooke. You have spent your entire life drifting, resisting every hand we held out to lift you up. And now, you throw your future into a ditch on the side of the highway. A bankrupt gas station. You've really outdone yourself. You are a fool. Don't come begging to the firm for a loan when the city slaps you with a dozen zoning violations," Blake sneered, tossing the deed back toward her. "Because I'll personally ensure the answer is no. You've humiliated this family for the last time." Chloe looked away, her expression a mix of embarrassment and calculated distance. "Brooke, think of how this looks. Charles's parents are hosting the spring gala next month. What am I supposed to tell them when they ask what my sister does? That she owns a junkyard." Brooke didn't answer her sister. She didn't look at her brother's smirk or her mother's trembling rage. Instead, she picked up her documents, folded them precisely, and stood up. "You don't have to tell them anything, Chloe," Brooke said calmly. "My choices are no longer your burden." As she walked down the long, mirrored hallway of the pillars, her boots clicking against the marble, a figure stepped out from the library. It was Uncle Marcus, Arthur's younger brother. Marcus was the family's resident ghost, a man who lived in a modest, hand-built cabin on the northern ridge, ignored by the rest of the family because he chose to carve wood rather than litigate contracts. Marcus placed a calloused hand on Brooke's shoulder. His eyes were kind, lined with the deep creases of a man who spent his days looking at the horizon rather than a ledger. "Value isn't always on the surface, Brooke," Marcus said quietly, his voice a low rumble. "The world is full of people who only know how to value things other people have already stamped a price tag on. Keep digging, kiddo. Don't let them make you loud. Stay quiet, and let the work speak." Brooke squeezed her uncle's hand, nodded, and walked out into the cool, damp night air. Chapter 3, The 30 Faces of Oak Ridge. The next morning, the town of Oak Ridge woke up to a new piece of gossip, and in a town of 12,000 people, gossip traveled faster than the morning delivery trucks. By 8 a.m., the lines were drawn. The town wasn't just an audience, it was an ecosystem, and Brooks Gamble had just introduced a tremor into its delicate balance. To understand what happened next, one had to understand the 30 people who held the strings of Oak Ridge's social and economic life. The core players formed the heart of the conflict. There was Brooke, determined and silent, Eleanor, whose pride was a fortress, Blake, who used the law as a scalpel, Uncle Marcus, the solitary anchor, and Sheriff Thomas Vance, a man whose family had policed the county since the Great Depression, known for an unyielding, literal interpretation of the law. Then there were the skeptics, those whose loyalty to the Rutledge name, or their reliance on it, made them natural adversaries to Brooke's venture. Arthur Rutledge chose the safety of his wife's ambition over his daughter's heart. Chloe and her fiancé, Charles Vane, saw the station as a direct threat to their impending high society wedding. Mayor Evelyn Croft, an elegant woman whose political campaigns were heavily funded by Rutledge and Associates, immediately instructed the Municipal Code Enforcement Office to scrutinize the property. Mr. Henderson, the president of Oak Ridge Trust, received a phone call from Blake before Brooke even walked through the bank's doors, ensuring her request for a small business line of credit was denied within minutes. Brenda Vance, the sheriff's wife and the head of the town's Historical Preservation Society, began drafting a petition declaring the old station a blight on the historical aesthetic of the Route 9 corridor. Attorney Donald Vance, Blake's junior partner, spent his morning researching ancient county ordinances to see if the town could condemn the property under eminent domain. In the country club circles, Victoria Sterling and her developer associate, Gavin Ross, were already calculating the land's failure value. Gavin wanted the corner lot for a mega pharmacy chain, and he knew that if Brooke choked on her taxes, he could buy it at a sheriff's sale for a fraction of its worth. But Brooke was not entirely alone. On the other side of the ledger stood the working-class backbone of Oak Ridge. Old Man Miller, the 82-year-old former owner of the station, sat on his porch 3 houses down, watching Brooke with a mixture of curiosity and faded memory. He had handed her a rusted iron key and an old, oil-stained leather binder containing the station's original 1980s blueprints, his eyes clouded with secrets he couldn't quite articulate anymore. Sammy Green, a 19-year-old high school dropout who lived with his grandmother, was the first to show up at the station with a weed whacker. Brooke had fixed his old moped for free 6 months ago, and Sammy never forgot a debt. Mrs. Higgins, who ran the Greasy Spoon Diner across the highway, began walking over twice a day with thermoses of black coffee and thick egg sandwiches, keeping an eye on Brooke like a protective hawk. Deputy Martinez, a young officer who had grown up on the rougher south side of the county, made sure his nightly patrol car lingered near the station's gravel lot, its headlights sweeping the shadows to deter any local teenagers looking to break windows. Clara Davis, the brilliant but reclusive town archivist who lived among stacks of yellowed newspapers and microfiche rolls at the public library, found herself drawn to Brooke's project, spending her evenings digging through old property records out of sheer professional curiosity. Support came from other practical hands as well. Tom, Toolbox, Taylor, a retired industrial welder with arms like oak logs, rolled his flatbed truck into the station lot on Tuesday morning, unloading an arc welder and a set of heavy hydraulic jacks without saying more than 4 words. Penny Lane, a local muralist who lived in a communal loft downtown, brought leftover exterior paint and began scraping the rusted white enamel of the station walls, her radio playing old blues tracks into the dusty air. Pastor John from the Methodist Church stopped by to leave a box of work gloves and a quiet blessing, reminding Brooke that the stone the builders rejected often becomes the cornerstone. Finally, there were the observers, the grease that kept the town's social engine moving. Reporter Rita Skeeter, as the locals called Rita Vaughn, the lead writer for the Oak Ridge Ledger, smelled a family feud from miles away. She and her cameraman, Pete, began parking their station wagon down the street, lenses pointed at Brooke's slow, agonizing progress. Mr. Finch, the hardware store owner, defied Eleanor's unspoken boycott by giving Brooke a 30% discount on drywall and timber, quietly cheered on by his teenage daughter, Lily Finch, who began posting daily updates of Brooke's restoration work on her social media pages, turning the Black Sheep station into a quiet internet phenomenon among the town's younger residents. Dr. Owens, the aging country physician, dropped by under the guise of buying an old oil can, using the opportunity to wrap Brooke's deeply blistered hands and warn her about tetanus. Sarah Jenkins, a traveling antique scout from the state capitol, pulled her station wagon into the gravel one afternoon, her eyes lighting up at the vintage 1970s Texaco star sign still hanging by a single rusted bolt from the roofline. Even Officer Higgins, a rookie under Sheriff Vance, and Judge Abraham Kent, a retired circuit court judge who spent his days fishing at the town reservoir, watched from their respective vantage points, waiting to see if the young woman would break under the immense, invisible pressure of the family name. Chapter 4, The First Strike of the Sledge. The station was a monument to neglect. Blackberry vines had grown through the broken panes of the garage bay windows, their thorns wrapping around old tire iron racks like iron wire. The roof over the main office had a 6-foot sag where a dead elm tree had fallen during a winter storm 10 years prior. The air inside smelled of ancient motor oil, damp earth, and the sweet, musty scent of decay. Brooke moved her world into a 12-foot vintage Airstream trailer she parked behind the garage bays. She had no running water for the first 3 days. She washed her face with a gallon jug of well water and used the facilities at Mrs. Higgins' diner across the road. On Wednesday morning, the first official blow fell. A white city vehicle pulled into the gravel lot. Mayor Evelyn Croft's chief code enforcement officer, a small, bureaucratic man named Mr. Albright, stepped out holding a clipboard like a shield. Brooke Rutledge, Albright said, his eyes scanning the rusted car parts Brooke had neatly organized by the side wall. Just Brooke, she corrected, wiping sweat from her forehead with her forearm. I have a list of 12 distinct municipal code violations here, Albright said, handing her a pink carbon copy sheet. Unsecured commercial structure, accumulation of industrial debris, lack of operational sanitation facilities, and unpermitted residential occupancy of an unzoned vehicle, referring to the trailer. Brooke took the paper. She didn't look angry, she looked down at the fine print with the same analytical precision she used when reading a wiring diagram. The structure is secured by deadbolts installed yesterday, Mr. Albright. The debris is categorized historic inventory, which is permitted under commercial storage guidelines for this zone. The sanitation line is being hooked up by Tom Taylor tomorrow morning. The permit was filed 3 days ago. And as for the trailer, I am performing 24-hour security for a commercial asset, which is legal under Section 4B of the Municipal Code. Albright blinked, his bureaucratic confidence wavering. He hadn't expected her to have read the code. Well, be that as it may, you have 7 days to rectify the structural sag in the main roof, or the city will issue a cease and desist and condemn the building. From across the lot, Tom, Toolbox, Taylor leaned against his truck, his massive arms crossed. Hey, Albright, tell the mayor that roof will be straight by Friday noon. I'm bringing the crane myself. Albright cleared his throat, took a step back, and climbed into his car without another word. Brooke looked at Tom, then at Sammy Green, who was busy piling up dead vines. They're not going to make this easy, she said. Good thing you're tough, Sammy said with a wide grin. My grandmammy says a Rutledge only knows how to fight with paper, but you know how to fight with iron. That night, Brooke worked by the light of a single halogen work lamp. Her hands were raw, her back ached with a deep, throbbing fatigue, and the loneliness of the dark highway felt immense. She could see the lights of the pillars gleaming on the distant ridge, a warm, golden glow that felt a million miles away. She knew that with one phone call, one admission of defeat to her mother, she could be back in that warm dining room, safe, protected, and completely empty. She picked up her wire brush and went back to scraping the rusted frame of a 1970s battery tester. She chose the grease. She chose the cold. She chose herself. Act 2, The Discovery. Chapter 5, Tearing Down the Drywall. By Saturday, the station had begun to change color. Penny Lane had helped Brooke prime the exterior walls a clean, stark white, and the iconic Texaco red trim had been carefully restored around the roofline. The sag in the ceiling was gone, held aloft by two massive steel I-beams that Tom Taylor had salvaged from an old granary demolition and welded into place with millimeter precision. Inside the main office, the air was thick with white dust. Brooke and Sammy were clearing out the old storage room at the back, a windowless 9x12 space that had been used to store old oil filters, promotional banners from the 1982 World's Fair, and decades of water-damaged paperwork. "This wall feels weird," Sammy said, thumping his fist against a section of wood paneling near the back corner, adjacent to the old utility closet. Brooke walked over. The paneling was typical late 1970s faux wood veneer, warped and stained by moisture. But when she pressed her palm against it, there was no give. It didn't sound hollow like the rest of the drywall studs. It sounded dense, dead, like solid masonry. "Get the crowbar, Sammy," Brooke said, her mechanical curiosity piqued. They wedged the iron bar beneath the baseboard and pried. The veneer split with a loud, dry crack, revealing not wood studs or fiberglass insulation, but a rough layer of cinder blocks. But these weren't standard structural blocks. They were laid flat, sealed with an unusually thick, sloppy layer of industrial mortar, as if someone had built a wall in a great hurry and didn't care about how it looked as long as it was solid. "What the heck?" Sammy muttered, wiping plaster dust from his safety goggles. Why would someone build a cinder block wall inside a drywall office? "They were hiding something," Brooke said. She went to her truck and brought back a 16-pound sledgehammer. Her muscles, hardened by a week of continuous labor, swung the heavy iron head in a clean, perfect arc. The hammer struck the center of the block wall with a deafening crack. A cloud of gray dust erupted. Brooke swung again, and then a third time. On the fourth strike, a chunk of the mortar gave way, falling inward with a heavy, metallic thud. Brooke held up her flashlight, shining the beam through the narrow opening. The light didn't hit earth or pipes. It glinted off a massive, dark green vertical surface made of reinforced steel. She could see heavy brass rivets and, as she shifted the angle of the light, the cold, gleaming circle of a mechanical combination dial. "Sammy," Brooke said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Go down to the creek and find Uncle Marcus. Tell him he needs to come here right now. And don't tell anyone else what we found." Chapter 6, The Steel Door. Within an hour, Uncle Marcus arrived in his old Ford truck, his face grave. Behind him came Clara Davis, the archivist, whom Marcus had picked up from the library on a hunch. Clara carried a leather satchel stuffed with old county plat maps and municipal registries. The four of them stood in the cramped, dusty storage room, the halogen lamp casting long, dramatic shadows against the exposed steel. They had cleared away the remaining cinder blocks, revealing a massive floor safe, 4 feet wide and 5 feet high, manufactured by the long-defunct Herring Hall Marvin Safe Company. It was a model designed in the mid-20th century for banks and high-security industrial facilities. "This isn't a standard commercial safe," Marcus said, running his fingers over the thick brass dial. "This is an vault door. This thing was built to survive a bomb." "Look at the logo," Clara Davis said, pointing her glasses toward a faded gold leaf emblem near the top handle. "It's stamped, Property of Oak Ridge Development Corp., 1979. Brooke looked at Clara. "Oak Ridge Development Corp. That was my grandfather's first company. The one he passed down to my father and Blake." "Exactly," Clara said, her eyes bright with the thrill of historical detection. "But according to the official county records I looked at last year, that company never had an office on Route 9. They were always based out of the downtown bank building." Then why is their vault hidden behind a fake wall in a roadside gas station? Sammy asked. That's what we're going to find out, Brooke said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the old leather binder that Old Man Miller had given her. She flipped through the yellowed pages, past grease receipts and spark plug orders, until she reached the very back. There, written in faded blue ballpoint ink on the back of a 1983 calendar page, was a series of numbers, 42188904. Miller gave me this, Brooke said. He told me he didn't remember what it was for, just that his business partner had told him to keep it safe before he disappeared in 1984. Brooke stepped up to the dial. The room went perfectly still. The only sound was the distant hum of trucks on the highway and the steady, heavy breathing of Uncle Marcus. She gripped the cold brass knob. Turn left 4 times to 42. Turn right 3 times to 18. Turn left twice to 89. Turn right slowly to 04. A heavy, internal metallic click resonated through the floorboards. It was a sound that felt as if it carried 40 years of stored tension. Brooke gripped the massive iron handle and pulled. The heavy steel door, perfectly balanced on its oiled hinges despite decades of confinement, swung outward with a low, ghostly groan. Chapter 7, The Ledger and the Legacy. The interior of the vault was immaculately dry, preserved by the airtight rubber seals of the heavy door. It wasn't filled with gold bars or stacks of cash. Instead, it contained rows of green canvas ledger books, 3 metal lockboxes, and a thick stack of blue-bordered legal documents secured by heavy canvas straps. Clara Davis stepped forward, her hands covered in white cotton archival gloves. She carefully lifted the top ledger book and opened it on Brooke's makeshift workbench. "Oh my lord," Clara whispered after 2 minutes of silence. "What is it, Clara?" Marcus asked, leaning over her shoulder. "This is the real history of Oak Ridge," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly. "Look at these entries. 1981, 1982, 1983. These aren't gas station receipts. These are cash payouts from the Oak Ridge Development Corp to municipal officials, city council members, and Judge Abraham Kent's predecessor." Brooke picked up the blue-bordered documents from the metal box. She began to read, her legal training, the education her mother thought she had wasted, kicking into high gear. Her eyes skipped across paragraphs of dense legalese, land descriptions, and quitclaim deeds. As she read, the true story of her family's pristine legacy unraveled in her hands. In 1982, the county had planned the Route 9 bypass. The land surrounding the old gas station, which at the time was hundreds of acres of dairy farm, was slated to become the new commercial heart of the town. Brooke's grandfather, along with her father, Arthur, had used the hidden cash funds in this ledger to systematically bribe local officials to alter the zoning maps in secret before the bypass was publicly announced. But the fraud went deeper. The original owner of the gas station and the surrounding land was a man named Thomas Miller, Old Man Miller's younger brother, who had died mysteriously in 1985. The documents in the safe proved that the Rutledges had falsified tax liens against the Miller property, forcing them into a manufactured foreclosure. More importantly, Brooke's thumb stopped on a certified, stamped deed from the State Land Registry, dated September 14, 1984. It was an original copy that had never been filed with the local county clerk, because the local county clerk at the time had been on the Rutledge payroll. The deed stated that the boundaries of the Texaco station property didn't stop at the gravel ditch. The original plot, Plot 412, included the entire 12 acres to the east. That 12 acres was currently the site of the Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza, a multi-million-dollar strip mall owned and operated by Blake Rutledge and financed by Charles Vane's family bank. "Brooke," Marcus said softly, his hand resting on the metal box. "Do you see what this means?" This property you bought for $45,000, legally, you didn't just buy an old gas station. You bought the ground beneath Blake's entire commercial empire. And these ledgers, they could destroy your father, your brother, and half the city council. Brooke stood perfectly still. The dust motes danced in the beam of the halogen lamp. She felt no rush of anger. She felt no desire to scream from the rooftops or call the news stations. She felt a profound, cool, and absolute clarity. "Sammy," Brooke said, her voice steady and quiet. "Go down to the station wagon and get my camera. We're going to photograph every single page of these ledgers before we move them." "What are you going to do, Brooke?" Clara asked, looking at her with a mixture of awe and fear. Brooke carefully closed the 1984 ledger, its canvas cover rough against her fingers. "I'm going to finish fixing this station. And then, I'm going to invite my family over for tea." Act 3, The Architecture of Truth. Chapter 8, The Strategy of Silence. For the next 2 weeks, Brooke did something that completely baffled the town of Oak Ridge. She did absolutely nothing. With the discovery, she didn't confront her parents. She didn't file a lawsuit. She didn't leak a single word to Rita Skeeter, who was practically begging for a scoop. Instead, she woke up every morning at 5 a.m., put on her grease-stained overalls, and continued to restore the Texaco station. With Tom Taylor's help, she installed vintage 1970s glass globe fuel pumps she had found in an old barn. Penny Lane finished painting the iconic red and white stripes. Mr. Finch delivered the interior oak trim, and Lily Finch posted videos of the progress that garnered tens of thousands of views. The derelict eyesore had transformed into a beautiful, nostalgic piece of living Americana. But behind the scenes, Brooke was working with a different kind of tool. Every evening, she, Uncle Marcus, and Clara Davis met in the Airstream trailer. They compiled a meticulous, cross-referenced legal dossier. They didn't use guesswork, they used the Rutledge's own signature styles against them. On a Thursday afternoon, Blake Rutledge pulled into the station lot in his black Mercedes sedan. He didn't get out of the car immediately. He sat behind his tinted glass, watching Brooke adjust the linkage on an old hydraulic lift. When he finally stepped out, his leather shoes clicked loudly against the fresh gravel. "Well, Brooke," Blake said, looking around with a dismissive smirk. "I have to admit, it looks pretty. You've done a nice job cleaning up the trash. But I hope you enjoyed the project, because it's over." Brooke didn't look up from her wrench. "Is it, Blake? The mayor's office is signing the development variance for the Route 9 corridor tomorrow morning," Blake said, drawing a legal document from his breast pocket. "The strip mall next door is expanding. We're putting in a 6-lane access road, and your little station sits right in the middle of the proposed easement. The city is going to acquire this lot through eminent domain for public utility. You'll get your $45,000 back from the state, but you're done here." Brooke wiped her hands on a rag, turned around, and looked her brother in the eyes. She didn't look panicked. She looked at him with a calm, analytical pity that made his smile falter. "The variance meeting is tomorrow at 10 a.m. at the Municipal Hall, right?" Brooke asked. "Yes," Blake said, his confidence returning. "Not that you can do anything about it. The legal framework is airtight. Tell Mother and Father to meet you there," Brooke said softly. "And tell Charles and his father to bring their bank counsel. I have a few title clearance items we should look over before the vote." Blake laughed, turning back toward his Mercedes. "Brooke, you don't have standing at a municipal variance board. But if you want to come watch the firm work, be my guest. It'll be a good lesson in how the real world operates." Chapter 9, The Court of Clean Truth. The Oak Ridge Municipal Council chamber was packed on Friday morning. The room was a sea of polished wood, brass rails, and historical oil paintings of the town's founders, half of whom were named Rutledge. Mayor Evelyn Croft sat at the center podium, flanked by the city council members. In the front row sat Eleanor and Arthur Rutledge, looking regal and detached. Next to them were Chloe and Charles Vane, along with Charles's father, the senior president of Oak Ridge Trust. Blake stood at the presentation lectern, his leather trial bag open, looking every bit the conquering prince. Sheriff Thomas Vance stood near the back doors, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. Next item on the docket, Mayor Croft announced, her voice echoing through the PA system. The Route 9 commercial easement and development variance for Plot 413, requested by Rutledge and Associates on behalf of Oak Ridge Plaza Group. The motion is straightforward, Madam Mayor, Blake said, stepping up to the microphone. The expansion of the commercial plaza will bring 300 jobs to the district. The acquisition of the adjacent property, the old Texaco station, is a necessary step for traffic flow and safety. Before the board votes, a calm, clear voice cut through the room from the center aisle. The crowd turned. Brooke walked down the carpeted aisle. She wasn't wearing overalls today, she wore a simple, tailored navy suit she had bought for her Vassar graduation. She carried no heavy bags, just a single, slim leather folder under her arm. Behind her walked Uncle Marcus and Clara Davis, who carried a large, wrapped cardboard display. Eleanor Rutledge stiffened in her seat, her eyes narrowing. "What is she doing?" she whispered fiercely to Arthur. "Brooke," Mayor Croft said, her tone sharp with annoyance. "This is a formal board hearing. Public comment was concluded last week. I am not here for public comment, Madam Mayor," Brooke said, standing at the adjacent lectern. "I am here as a primary property owner with a title dispute that supersedes this board's jurisdiction." Blake smiled, leaning against his podium. "Brooke, we've seen your deed. You own Plot 412. The easement is on Plot 413. Your station is 60 feet away from the plaza boundary. According to the records filed by your firm in 1985, that is correct," Brooke said. She opened her folder and drew out 3 high-resolution, certified color prints. However, according to the original state land title registry deed from September 1984, discovered behind the vault wall of the Texaco station 3 weeks ago, Plot 412 was never 60 feet wide. Brooke nodded to Uncle Marcus, who uncovered the display board. It was a massive, detailed map of the Route 9 corridor, overlaid with the original 1984 state survey lines. The original deed, Brooke's voice resonated through the silent room, completely devoid of anger or theatricality, states that Plot 412 extends 400 feet to the east. The boundaries include the land beneath the main building of the Oak Ridge Commercial Plaza, the eastern parking structure, and the entire access road. The chamber went dead silent. You could hear the faint, rhythmic ticking of the historical clock on the back wall. "That's absurd," Blake shouted, his face suddenly turning a violent, dark crimson. "That's a forgery, the county records clearly state." "The county records were altered," Brooke interrupted, her voice dropping an octave, remaining perfectly calm. "By Donald Vance and Arthur Rutledge on November 12, 1984. Clara, please provide the board with the copies of the original cash ledger found inside the Herring Hall Marvin safe, stamped with the Oak Ridge Development Corp logo." Clara Davis stepped forward, handing a thick packet of certified documents to the city council secretary. "Inside that packet," Brooke continued, "you will find 42 distinct entries detailing cash transfers from my father's corporate account to the former county clerk, the former zoning chairman, and 3 members of this very council's historical predecessors. The purpose of those payments was the suppression of the 1984 title registry and the manufacturing of a fraudulent foreclosure against the Miller family." Arthur Rutledge didn't move. He sat in his leather chair, his face completely drained of color, his mouth slightly open. He looked like an ice sculpture that had begun to melt from the inside out. Eleanor turned to her husband, her fingers digging into his arm so hard her knuckles turned white. "Arthur, tell them she's lying. Arthur." But Arthur couldn't speak. He knew the ledger. He knew the safe Act 1, the crucible of expectations. Chapter 1, The Sunday Dinner. The dining room at the Rutledge estate was an exercise in curated oppression. Beneath a crystal chandelier that had once hung in a minor European embassy, the family gathered every Sunday at precisely 6 o'clock. The table was solid mahogany, polished to such a high sheen that it reflected the tense, pale faces of those seated around it like a dark mirror. Eleanor Rutledge sat at the head, her posture as rigid as the high-backed upholstered chair she occupied. Her fingers, adorned with diamonds that had survived 3 economic collapses, wrapped around a silver water goblet. To her right sat Arthur, a man whose hair had gone silver before 40, his eyes perpetually fixed on a horizon of spreadsheet margins and board resolutions. "The soup is cold, Brooke," Eleanor said. Her voice lacked heat. It was cold, sharp, and perfectly metered, the tone she used for disappointing domestic staff and her middle daughter. Brooke Rutledge didn't look up from her plate. She was 28, with skin that bore the faint, indelible shadows of engine grease beneath the fingernails, no matter how hard she scrubbed with pumice soap before crossing her mother's threshold. Her dress was navy blue, bought from a department store rack, a stark contrast to her sister Chloe's tailored silk cream blouse. "It's vichyssoise, Mother," Brooke said quietly. "It's supposed to be cold." Across the table, Blake Rutledge chuckled. It was a wet, arrogant sound that had carried him through Princeton Law and into a junior partnership at the town's oldest firm before his 26th birthday. "Don't correct her on French cuisine, Brooke. It makes you look like you're trying too hard. Leave the culture to Chloe." Chloe Rutledge Vane smiled into her wine glass. Her husband, Charles Vane, an investment broker whose family owned 2/3 of the local country club, gave a tight, patronizing nod. "Every family needs an academic, Blake. Or at least someone who reads the menu." The casual cruelty of the table was a language Brooke had spent a lifetime learning to decode. In the Rutledge ledger, value was measured in square footage, billable hours, and the names of ancestors on town charters. Oak Ridge, a valley town that had transitioned from a manufacturing hub to a wealthy enclave for commuters and retired executives, belonged to them, or so they believed. Arthur cleared his throat, the signal that the patriarch was about to deliver a verdict. He laid his linen napkin beside his plate with a slow, deliberate fold. "Brooke, the Human Resources Department at the firm tells me you haven't returned their calls regarding the compliance clerk opening. It's been 3 weeks. I'm not taking the job, Dad," Brooke said. She picked up her water glass, her hand steady despite the tightening in her chest. Eleanor set her goblet down with a small clink that sounded like a small hammer hitting an anvil. "And may we ask what project has taken precedence over an entry-level position at your father's firm? The last we heard, you were renting a garage from that mechanic on the highway." "Old man Miller retired," Brooke said. "He's 72. His knees gave out. A tragedy for the grease monkey community," Blake said, leaning back as the maid, a quiet woman named Maria, cleared the soup bowls. "But that doesn't answer the question, Brooke. What are you doing for money? The trust fund from grandfather doesn't kick in until you're 35, and at the rate you're going, you won't have enough credit to buy a used tire by then." Brooke took a deep breath. She had known this moment was coming for 6 months. She had saved every dollar from her 5 years of working as an independent restoration mechanic, fixing the vintage Alfa Romeos and old Ford trucks that the wealthy residents of Oak Ridge owned but didn't know how to maintain. She had skipped meals, lived in a cold water flat above a dry cleaner, and kept her ledger in a small black book that never left her jacket pocket. "I bought the old Texaco station on Route 9, she said. The dining room went completely silent. Even Maria stopped in the doorway, a stack of porcelain plates balanced in her hands. The station on Route 9 was a local landmark of decay. It sat at the intersection where the old state highway met the new bypass, a 3-acre triangle of cracked asphalt, rusted iron pumps with glass crowns that had been smashed by teenagers in the 90s, and a flat-roofed cinderblock building that had been overtaken by poison ivy and wild sumac since the pumps ran dry during the mid-80s oil glut. Blake was the first to break the silence. His laugh started as a snort and then turned into a loud, braying roar that made the chandelier pieces jingle. "The Texaco. The one behind the old abandoned chemical depot. Brooke, that place isn't land, it's an environmental liability. The tanks under the ground are probably rusted through. The EPA will fine you into bankruptcy before you can clear the weeds." "The tanks were pulled in 1989, Brooke said, her voice dropping into that low, level register she used when she was reading a technical manual. "I checked the county records with Clara Davis at the Historical Society. The site was cleared for commercial use in 1994, but the owner died in probate. The state's been holding the tax lien for 32 years. And you paid it." Arthur's voice was no longer distant, it was sharp, narrow. "With what?" "My savings," Brooke said. $45,000. Every cent." Eleanor closed her eyes. Her face looked like a mask carved from lard. $45,000. You could have bought a condominium. You could have put a down payment on a proper life. Instead, you've bought an eyesore on a highway that leads to nowhere. "It leads to the new industrial park, Mother," Brooke countered gently. "The truck traffic has tripled since the state expanded the exit." "You are a hopeless failure, Brooke," Eleanor whispered, her eyes opening to fix her daughter with a cold, pale stare. "You have always chosen the mud over the parlor. Your brother is building a practice that will support this family for another 50 years. Your sister has secured an alliance with the Vanes. And you are a common laborer with a piece of junk on the side of the road. You've embarrassed us for the last time." "Let her have it," Blake said, his eyes glittering with a malicious amusement. "When the roof caves in or the county shuts her down for code violations, she can come work for me as a courier. I'll pay her $10 an hour to drive my Mercedes to the courthouse. At least she knows how to change the oil." Charles Vane checked his watch. "We should get moving if we want to catch the early feature at the club, Chloe." Brooke stood up. She didn't push her chair back with a scrape. She lifted it slightly, set it down without a sound, and picked up her canvas coat from the bench by the door. She didn't look at her mother's frozen face or her father's downcast eyes. From the end of the table, near the heavy velvet curtains, Uncle Marcus spoke for the first time. He was Arthur's older brother, a man who had walked away from the family firm 30 years prior to live in a cedar cabin near the reservoir, building Windsor chairs by hand. He had been invited only because Eleanor insisted on maintaining the fiction of an undivided family for the holidays. "Value isn't always on the surface, Brooke," Marcus said, his voice rough from tobacco and solitude. "Sometimes you have to clear away 20 feet of garbage just to find the foundation. Don't let them tell you what the dirt is worth before you've dug into it." "Thank you, Uncle Marcus," Brooke said. "Marcus, please do not encourage her delusions," Eleanor snaps. Brooke turned the brass knob of the front door and stepped out into the October night. The air tasted of wood smoke and damp earth, real things, cold things. Behind her, the door clicked shut, the sound of an iron gate swinging into place. Chapter 2, The View from Route 9. The next morning, the sun rose over the Oak Ridge Hills like an unpolished copper coin. Brooke stood in the center of the asphalt apron of the Texaco station, a thermos of black coffee in one hand and a 3-pound sledgehammer in the other. The property looked worse in the daylight than it had in her memory. The main building was a single-story structure built of heavy utility blocks, painted that stark, corporate white and green that Texaco had favored during the post-war boom, now peeling away in long, gray scabs. 2 service bays sat on the left, their roll-up corrugated doors rusted into their tracks about 6 inches from the ground, leaving a dark gap where wild rabbits and field mice scrambled. To the right was the office, a 6x10 space with a plate glass window that had been shattered and boarded up with weathered plywood. Above the pump island, the iron framework of the old canopy leaned 3 degrees to the west, its sheet metal skin groaning whenever the wind came off the river. A car slowed down on the highway. It was a silver BMW, its turn signal blinking once before it pulled onto the gravel shoulder opposite the station. The window rolled down halfway. Brenda Vance, the sheriff's wife and the undisputed Grand Inquisitor of the Oak Ridge social calendar, peered out through oversized sunglasses. Beside her sat Victoria Sterling, whose family owned the local country club's golf course. "Brooke, dear," Brenda called out, her voice carrying over the idling engine. "Is it true? Eleanor said you were doing some volunteer charity work out here. A cleanup project for the Historical Commission." Brooke walked toward the road, her boots crunching on the gravel. She didn't smile, but her face was perfectly polite. "No, Mrs. Vance. I bought it. It's my shop now." Victoria Sterling leaned across the console, her pearls clicking against the steering wheel. "Oh, honey, a shop. For what? The vintage car market is in North Monmouth, dear. No one from the Ridge is going to bring their Jaguars down to this corner. It's where the diesel trucks park when they have a leak." "Then I'll fix the diesel trucks," Brooke said. Brenda's expression hardened from false pity into something colder. "Your mother must be simply beside herself. The Garden Club is hosting the regional tour next month, and this road is the main entrance from the interstate. We can't have this being the first thing the judges see. Then I suggest you tell them to look at the hills on the left, Mrs. Vance," Brooke said. "They're very beautiful this time of year." The BMW's window rolled up with a swift, electric hiss, and the car pulled away, its tires spitting small stones into the ditch. Brooke walked back to the service bay. She wasn't angry, she was calculating. She had exactly $3,000 left in her checking account after paying the state and purchasing a commercial insurance policy. That was her fuel, her food, and her parts budget for the next 3 months. If she couldn't get one bay open and a heater running before the first frost, she would be what Blake said she was, a footnote in the family history of success. A rattling noise behind her made her turn. A rusty pickup truck, its bed filled with old lawnmowers and plastic gas cans, pulled up to the office door. The door creaked open, and Sammy Green climbed out. He was 19, with a permanent smudge of charcoal on his forehead and a pair of oversized work boots that looked like they belonged to an older brother. He had been Brooke's apprentice at Miller's garage for 6 months before it closed. "Miss Rutledge," Sammy said, pulling off a greasy baseball cap. "My mom said you bought this place. Said you were crazy. I told her you weren't crazy, you just didn't like people telling you what to do." "Thanks, Sammy," Brooke said, a small smile finally breaking through her professional mask. "Your mom might be right, though. Look at this roof." Sammy looked up at the sagging canopy. "We can fix that with a come-along and 2 4x4s. My cousin's got a winch on his Jeep. Want me to call him?" "Not yet," Brooke said. "First, we need to get inside the office. The lock on the main door is rusted solid, and I don't want to break the frame if I can help it." "Old man Miller told me about this place once," Sammy said, walking around the side toward the utility room where the old air compressor used to sit. "He said the guy who owned it back in the 80s, a fellow named Vance, not the sheriff, but his uncle, was a strange one. Used to keep 3 dogs in the back and never let anyone inside the storeroom. Not even the oil delivery guy. Brooke followed him around the back. The briars were thick here, their thorns catching on her canvas trousers. Why? Miller said he thought the guy was running numbers or selling untaxed kerosene, Sammy said, kicking at an old oil drum that had rusted into the soil until it disintegrated into brown flakes. But then the state came in overnight and shut him down. The guy just disappeared. No one ever saw him again. Brooke stood before the rear utility door. It was solid iron, set into a reinforced concrete frame. Unlike the front office door, which was cheap aluminum and plywood, this door looked like it belonged on a bank vault or a commercial cold storage facility. There was no keyhole, only a heavy mechanical padlock that was covered in a layer of grease so thick it had preserved the metal underneath from 30 years of rain. "That's not standard Texaco architecture," Brooke muttered, touching the cold iron of the lock. "Want me to get the torch?" Sammy asked. "No," Brooke said, lifting the 3-pound sledgehammer. "Let's see how good the welds are first." Act 2, The Anatomy of a Town. Chapter 3, The Social Grid. By midweek, the news of Brooke's purchase had circulated through Oak Ridge like an infection through an isolation ward. In a town where everyone knew the exact balance of their neighbor's mortgage and the cost of their landscaping contract, a Rutledge buying a derelict gas station was more than a scandal, it was a disruption of the local ecology. At the Oak Ridge Country Club, the morning card room was full. Eleanor Rutledge sat by the large picture window that overlooked the 14th green, her tea cooling in a porcelain cup. "It's the Independents," said Victoria Sterling, shuffling a deck of cards with practiced efficiency. "Some girls just have that wild streak. Remember the Miller boy who ran off to join the Merchant Marine? His father was a senior vice president at the bank. The Miller boy didn't buy a toxic waste site 4 miles from his mother's greenhouse, Victoria," Eleanor said, her voice dropping an octave. "She is doing this to provoke Arthur. He refused to fund her workshop last year because she wouldn't sign the standard family governance agreement. The one that gives Blake veto power over her business assets," asked Chloe, who had just entered from the tennis courts, her white skirt immaculate. She sat beside her mother, helping herself to a small cucumber sandwich. "Honestly, Mother, Blake was just trying to protect her from herself. She has no concept of corporate structure. She thinks if you work 12 hours a day and your hands are dirty, you've earned something. It's so, 19th century. Mayor Croft is already looking into it," Eleanor said, adjusting her rings. "I spoke to Evelyn this morning at the charity breakfast. The town has very specific ordinances regarding the storage of commercial vehicles and hazardous materials within 500 yards of the municipal watershed. If Brooke thinks she can turn that highway into an open-air junkyard, she'll find herself in front of Judge Kent before the month is out." "Is Abraham Kent still taking cases?" Chloe asked, surprised. "I thought he retired to his orchard." "He handles the municipal appeals," Eleanor said coldly. "And he's an old friend of your father's. He understands that a town like Oak Ridge survives on its appearance. We cannot allow one person's emotional tantrum to devalue the property of 300 families." 2 miles down the hill, in a very different room, the conversation was less genteel but far more practical. Mrs. Higgins' diner sat across from the old railway depot, its windows steamed from the large commercial dishwashers and the heat of the flat-top grill. At the counter sat Tom Toolbox Taylor, a man whose shoulders looked like they had been forged from the structural steel he had spent 40 years welding for the County Road Commission. Beside him was Mr. Finch, the owner of Finch Hardware, a third-generation business that had survived the big box stores by knowing exactly which size screw every old house in the valley needed. "The girl's got grit," Tom Taylor said, chewing on a piece of thick-cut bacon. "I saw her out there yesterday with that green kid. They were pulling 3-inch sumac roots out of the asphalt with nothing but a log chain and a rusty bumper. Didn't see her brother out there helping. He was probably down at the courthouse suing some widow for her fence line. Blake's a shark, Mr. Finch said, shaking his head as he poured sugar into his coffee. He came into the shop last month looking for the old plot maps for the South Valley. Said the firm was doing an audit for some development group. He wanted to know if I had records of the old right-of-ways from the rail line. When I told him those files were over at the Historical Society with Clara, he got real short with me. Acted like I was hiding something. He's looking for land, Mrs. Higgins said, leaning over the counter with a fresh pot of coffee. That whole family's been sniffing around the highway since the state announced the logistics park. My brother works the night shift at the toll plaza, and he says he sees Arthur's Lincoln and that real estate fellow, Gavin Ross, driving up and down that road twice a week. They aren't looking at the scenery. Well, they won't get the Texaco, Tom Taylor chuckled. Brooks got the deed. I saw the filing on the county wall. She bought it clear. Clear ain't always clear when the Rutledges want the dirt, Finch muttered. I gave her 20% off on 5 gallons of white zinc primer yesterday. Her money's good. She paid cash, right out of an old leather pouch. No credit cards. No checks with her father's name on 'em. Good for her, Mrs. Higgins said. I'm taking her some chicken salad at noon. That girl looks like she hasn't eaten a full meal since she left home. Chapter 4, The Archive. While the town talked, Brooke was sitting in the basement of the Oak Ridge Public Library, where the air smelled of vinegar and crumbling sulfur. Clara Davis, the town archivist, was 81 years old and possessed a memory that functioned like a card catalog of every sin committed within 50 miles since the Great Depression. She wore a heavy green cardigan and thick spectacles that turned her eyes into large, intelligent globes. On the table between them lay 3 large leather-bound volumes, the county tax assessments for District 4 from 1975 to 1985. You're looking for Silas Vance, Clara said, her thin fingers turning the heavy, cream-colored pages with a scratchy sound. He was the sheriff's uncle. A difficult man. Never married, never went to church, never paid his bills on time, but he always had money. He bought that 3-acre parcel from the railroad in 1972 for $700. And the station was built when? Brooke asked, her pencil poised over her notebook. 74, Clara said. He put up the building himself. He didn't use local contractors. He hired a crew from the city, men who lived in trailers behind the site for 3 weeks and then left without ever buying a drink at the tavern. People thought it was strange then. A gas station doesn't need 6-inch reinforced concrete walls in the back room. Brooke leaned forward. What about the closing? Sammy said the state shut him down. The state tax division came in with 2 troopers on November 14, 1984. Clara said, pointing her finger at a small, red stamp at the bottom of the 1984 ledger page. They claimed he owed $22,000 in unpaid fuel excise taxes. But here's the odd thing, Brooke. The file contains no record of a sale or an auction. The property just sat there. Silas Vance vanished that same week. His truck was found at the long-term parking lot at the airport in Philadelphia, but his bank accounts were never touched. The state put a lien on it, but they never pushed it to foreclosure until you bought the paper last month. Why did they let it sit for 40 years? Brooke asked. A prime corner on a state highway. Clara looked over her glasses, her voice dropping to a whisper. Because every time the county council tried to put it on the public auction list, someone from your father's firm would submit a memorandum stating that the property was under environmental investigation by an undisclosed corporate buyer. It kept the title locked up. Nobody wants to buy a piece of dirt if the Rutledge firm says it's full of PCBs. Brooke felt a cold drop of certainty settle in her stomach. They didn't want anyone else to buy it. They wanted it to stay dead, Clara said. Until the time was right. Your brother Blake spent 3 days down here in August looking through these exact books, Brooke. He didn't think I was watching him, but I've been watching Rutledge's since your grandfather was in short pants. He was copying the boundary lines for the parcel next door, the old Miller Orchard that's now the strip mall. The strip mall's owned by an LLC called Oak Ridge North Corporation, Brooke said. And do you know who owns the shares of Oak Ridge North Corporation? Clara asked, a small, grim smile appearing on her face. It's registered in Delaware, but the local agent is Donald Vance, the sheriff's brother and Blake's partner at the firm. Your family's been building a box around that highway corner for 30 years, Brooke. And you just bought the hole in the middle of it. Brooke closed her notebook. She stood up and pulled her coat on. Thank you, Clara. Be careful with that sledgehammer, child, Clara said, her voice following Brooke toward the stairs. Sometimes when you knock down an old wall, the things that were holding it up come down on your head. Act 3, The Discovery. Chapter 5, The Iron Room. The storm hit Oak Ridge on Thursday night. It wasn't a winter snow, but a late autumn gale that brought 4 inches of cold, heavy rain that turned the gravel apron of the Texaco station into a gray soup. Brooke stayed in the office. She had set up her small kerosene heater in the corner, and the small space smelled of fuel, damp wool, and the old linoleum she had spent 3 hours scraping off the floor blocks. Sammy had gone home at 5, but Brooke couldn't leave. The wind was howling through the rusted canopy outside, making the iron sheets rattle like musketry. She took her flashlight and walked into the back storage room. The room was 5 feet wide and 10 feet long, with no windows. The walls were made of standard cinder blocks, but the rear wall, the one that separated the storage space from the old air compressor alcove, was different. When she knocked on it with her knuckles, it didn't give that hollow, dry thud of a utility block. It sounded solid, like a concrete pier. She picked up the 3-pound sledgehammer. She had been working on the corner of the wall for 2 days, clearing away the rotten shelves and the old, oil-soaked cardboard boxes that had melted into the floor over 40 years. She swung the hammer. The impact vibrated up her arms, a sharp, bone-rattling shock. A piece of the outer green plaster cracked away, revealing not the gray aggregate of a common block, but a sheet of dark, pitted iron plate. Brooke stopped. She wiped the sweat from her eyes with her sleeve, her heart pounding against her ribs. She set the flashlight on an old oil drum, positioning the beam so it struck the wall horizontally, casting long shadows across the cracks. She swung again, harder this time, targeting the mortar joint where the cinder blocks met the iron plate. A 4-foot section of the false block wall crumbled forward, releasing a cloud of white, choking lime dust. Behind the blocks was a steel door, 5 inches thick, set into a massive frame of reinforced channel iron that had been bolted directly into the concrete foundation with 2-inch studs. In the center of the door was a mechanical dial, a heavy, brass combination lock manufactured by the Diebold Safe and Lock Company of Canton, Ohio, with a patent date of 1978. The steel was covered in a thick layer of cosmoline, the heavy, waxy petroleum compound used to protect military equipment from rust. The grease had done its job perfectly. Under the dust of 40 years, the steel was as bright and silver as the day it had been rolled in the mill. Brooke knelt before the dial. Her fingers were shaking slightly, so she sat back on her heels and took 3 long, slow breaths. She was a mechanic. She understood machines. A safe was just a gearbox with an attitude. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small leather-bound ledger she had borrowed from Old Man Miller. In the very back, on a page containing the service records for Silas Vance's 1979 Chevy truck, Miller had scribbled a series of numbers in red ink. 44 left 2 CLICKS 82 right 3 to 11. Silas, Brooke whispered, her voice lost in the roar of the rain on the roof. Let's see what you were saving for. She turned the brass dial. It moved with a silky, heavy resistance, the internal tumblers clicking with a tiny, metallic snick that she felt through the tips of her fingers rather than heard through the noise of the storm. 44 left. She passed the number twice, then stopped exactly on the line. 82 right. 3 full rotations, then a slow, deliberate crawl until the pointer aligned with the copper mark. 11. A half turn back to the left. She placed her right hand on the heavy T-handle of the vault door. It was cold, colder than the air in the room. She braced her boots against the concrete floor and pulled up with everything she had. For a second, nothing happened. The grease held the seal like glue. Then, with a long, wet suck of escaping air, the handle turned 45 degrees. The door swung outward on its heavy, machined hinges. It didn't squeak, it was so perfectly balanced that it moved with the pressure of a single finger. Inside was a recess 3 feet deep and 4 feet high, lined with unpainted cedar boards that had kept the interior dry and sweet-smelling despite 40 years of damp earth underneath. On the top shelf sat 6 metal ammunition boxes, their olive drab paint clean and free of rust. On the bottom shelf was a single, large leather-bound ledger, identical to the ones her father kept in his vault at the firm, but bound in dark blue Morocco leather instead of black. Brooke didn't touch the ammunition boxes first. She reached for the ledger. She opened the cover. On the first page, written in the elegant, copperplate handwriting of her grandfather, Charles Rutledge, were the words, Oak Ridge Land and Development Trust, Private Capital Accounts, 1974-1984. Brooke sat down on the cold concrete floor, the flashlight resting on her knee, and began to read. Chapter 6, The Weight of the Ledger. 2 hours later, the rain had stopped, replaced by the heavy, dripping silence of a clearing sky. Inside the office, the kerosene heater flickered, its flame burning low. Brooke hadn't moved. The blue ledger lay open across her lap, its pages covered in her grandfather's neat script, interspersed with notes written in her father Arthur's tighter, more aggressive hand from the early 80s. The story it told was not one of business success, but of a quiet, systematic theft that had transformed Oak Ridge from a working-class valley into a playground for the wealthy. In 1976, the town had planned to build the highway bypass through the northern ridge, land that was then owned by 40 small dairy farmers and orchards. The ledger detailed a series of private payments made by Charles Rutledge and Arthur Rutledge to members of the town council, including the current mayor Evelyn Croft's father, who was then the zoning chairman. The bribes were paid to alter the official state survey maps, shifting the proposed highway route 3 miles south, directly through the land owned by Silas Vance and Old Man Miller's family. But that was only the preamble. The real weight of the book lay in the receipts. Silas Vance hadn't been a criminal running numbers, he had been a man who refused to sell his 3 acres to the Rutledges when they realized the new intersection would become the most valuable commercial corner in the county. When he wouldn't budge, Arthur Rutledge had used his position as the bank's chief counsel to fabricate a series of fuel excise tax liens, using forged state documents provided by Donald Vance, who was then a clerk in the tax office. They had driven Silas Vance out of town by threatening him with 20 years in a state penitentiary for a crime that didn't exist. The ammunition boxes on the top shelf didn't contain bullets, they contained the original, unfiled titles for every commercial property in the downtown district, titles that Silas Vance had collected as security when he tried to help the local farmers fight the Rutledge firm's foreclosures. Among the documents was a deed from 1982, signed by the county surveyor and stamped with the official seal. It proved that the boundary line of the Texaco property didn't stop at the ditch, It extended 60 feet to the east, encompassing the entire 5 acres where the Oak Ridge North Strip Mall now stood. The mall, the property that generated $300,000 a year in lease income for Blake and his partners, was sitting on land that belonged to the owner of the Texaco station. Brooke closed the book. Her hands were cold, but her mind was clearer than it had ever been in her life. The family pride, the diamond rings, the country club charity tours, the condescending remarks at Sunday dinner, it was all paid for with paper stolen from a man who had died in an anonymous rooming house in Philadelphia because he didn't have the money to hire a lawyer to fight her father. She stood up, lifted the ledger, and placed it inside a clean canvas tool bag. Then she took one of the ammunition boxes down, opened it, and confirmed the contents: hundreds of pages of original surveyor notes, tax receipts with fake cancellation stamps, and letters signed by her mother, Eleanor, authorizing payments from the family's private trust accounts to anonymous consultants, who happened to share the last names of 3 town councilmen. A phone rang in the front office. It was a sharp, mechanical bell that sounded unnaturally loud in the empty building. Brooke walked out and picked up the receiver. Brooke. It was Blake's voice. It was late, and she could hear the background noise of the country club bar, the low murmur of ice in glasses and the laughter of Charles Vane. "Yes, Blake," she said, her voice dropping into that level, unreadable tone. "Look, I'm only calling because Mother is making myself and Arthur miserable," Blake said, his speech slightly slurred from Scotch. The town code officer, Miller, well, not old man Miller, but his nephew, is going to issue an injunction tomorrow morning about those vintage cars you've got parked behind the bays. He's going to fine you $500 a day. Arthur's willing to buy the property back from you for $35,000. You take a $10,000 loss, but you get your name off the lien and you don't have to go to court. It's a generous offer, Brooke. More than you deserve. Brooke looked through the boarded-up window toward the highway, where the moon was breaking through the clouds, reflecting off the pools of water on the asphalt. "Tell Dad I'll see him at the station tomorrow morning at 10, Brooke said. "You should come too, Blake. And bring Donald Vance. We have some title issues to clear up." "Title issues?" Blake laughed. "Brooke, we drew the titles for that district 20 years ago. There are no issues." 10 o'clock, Blake, Brooke said, and hung up the phone. Act 4, The Gathering. Chapter 7, The Array of Forces. The morning sun of Friday was sharp and clear, washing the valley in a bright, unforgiving light that made every rust spot on the Texaco pumps look like an open wound. By 9:30, the station was no longer empty. Sammy Green had arrived first, his truck parked by the service bay, his face anxious as he watched the road. Beside him stood Tom, toolbox, Taylor, wearing his heavy canvas work jacket, and Mr. Finch, who had brought a large brass clipboard containing the original town hardware ledgers from 1980. At 9:45, a white county cruiser pulled onto the apron. Sheriff Thomas Vance climbed out, his uniform pressed, his silver star glinting in the light. He wasn't accompanied by a deputy, he had driven himself. He walked over to Brooke, who was sitting on a clean wooden bench outside the office door, the canvas tool bag resting between her feet. "Brooke," the sheriff said, nodding to the other men. "Your brother called me this morning. Said you were planning some kind of disturbance out here. Said you were refusing to comply with the code enforcement order." "There's no disturbance, Sheriff," Brooke said. "I'm just waiting for my family to arrive. I think you'll want to be here when they do. It concerns your Uncle Silas." Sheriff Vance's expression shifted. The professional distance of a lawman remained, but his eyes narrowed. "Silas has been gone 40 years, Brooke. There's nothing out here but old iron. We found the safe, Thomas," Uncle Marcus said, walking out from the service bay. He had driven his old farm truck down from the Reservoir at dawn, his flannel shirt clean, his hands tucked into his pockets. The one Silas built with the crew from the city. It's open. The sheriff looked from Marcus to Brooke, then down at the canvas bag. He didn't say anything, but he didn't leave. He moved to the edge of the pump island, his arms crossed over his chest, waiting. At exactly 10 o'clock, 3 cars pulled onto the property in a small, solemn convoy. First was Arthur Rutledge's black Lincoln town car. Then came Blake's silver Mercedes sedan. Bringing up the rear was a corporate SUV containing Donald Vance, Blake's legal partner, and Gavin Ross, the real estate developer who had been trying to buy the highway frontage for 3 years. Eleanor Rutledge stayed in the front seat of the Lincoln, her window rolled up, her face visible behind the tinted glass like an exhibit in a museum of old wealth. Blake climbed out of the Mercedes, adjusting his camel hair coat. He looked at the gathered group of working men with an expression of intense irritation. "What is this, Brooke? A union meeting?" Blake walked toward the bench, his leather shoes clicking on the damp asphalt. "Arthur's here. We have the quitclaim deed in the car. Sign it, take the check, and let's end this circus. You've got half the town watching you make a fool of yourself." Arthur Rutledge climbed out of the Lincoln more slowly. He looked older in the morning light, his shoulders slightly rounded beneath his wool coat. He didn't look at his daughter, he looked at the building, his eyes scanning the green and white paint, the repaired trim, and the dark opening of the service bay where the false wall had been cleared away. "Where's Donald?" Brooke asked, her voice calm and level. Donald Vance, a heavy-set man with a leather briefcase and an expensive silk tie, stepped forward from the SUV. "I'm here, Brooke. As the representative for Oak Ridge North Corporation, I'm advising you that your presence on this property is impeding the development of the adjoining parcel. We've already filed a notice of intent regarding the drainage easement." Brooke stood up. She picked up the canvas bag, opened it, and pulled out the blue Morocco leather ledger. She didn't hand it to Blake, she laid it flat on the vintage wooden desk she had moved onto the asphalt for the meeting. "This is my grandfather's book, Donald," Brooke said. "The one from the private vault. The one you and Blake thought was destroyed when the old firm office was remodeled in '92. Donald Vance stopped. His hand stayed on the latch of his briefcase, his fingers freezing mid-motion. Arthur Rutledge took 2 steps forward, his face turning the color of wet lime dust. "Where did you find that?" "Behind the false wall in the tool room," Brooke said. "Next to the titles for the downtown district and the original 1982 survey map for the highway intersection." Blake sneered, though his voice had lost its liquidity. "So what? Grandfather kept old records. That doesn't change the fact that you're bankrupt and the county's shutting you down." "It changes everything, Blake," Brooke said softly. She turned a page of the ledger, pointing to a column of figures from October 1983. "This is the record of the $30,000 paid to Donald's father, who was then the county recorder, to alter the filed deed for the Miller Orchard. And this," she pulled a heavy parchment sheet from the bag, "is the original deed for this station, signed by the State Highway Commissioner in 1982. The boundary line doesn't stop at the fence. It runs through the middle of the pharmacy and the dry cleaner at the strip mall." "That's impossible," Blake barked, stepping toward the table. "We reviewed the title insurance policy 5 years ago. You reviewed the policy you wrote, Blake," Donald Vance whispered, his voice cracking. He didn't look at Blake, he looked at Sheriff Thomas Vance, who had stepped away from the pump island and was now standing 3 feet behind his brother. "Thomas," Donald said, his hands beginning to shake. This is an internal family matter. It's a civil dispute over boundary lines. It looks like an old fraud file to me, Donald," Sheriff Vance said, his voice flat and heavy. He reached out and took the parchment deed from Brooke's hand, his eyes scanning the official county seal and the signature of his Uncle Silas. This is Silas's signature. I know it because I have his old service record at the house. He didn't abandon this place. You boys ran him out. He was an tax evader. Blake shouted, his face turning red, his professional veneer cracking completely. He owed the state $22,000. The firm cleared the lien. The firm created the lien, Blake, Brooke said. She didn't raise her voice, she spoke with the quiet, devastating clarity of an auditor reading a closing balance. The state tax receipts are in the third ammunition box inside the vault. They were marked, paid in full, on September 12, 1984. Arthur signed the cancellation check from the trust account, but he never filed it with the courthouse. He held it so he could threaten Silas with foreclosure if he didn't hand over the deeds to the downtown lots. Gavin Ross, the developer, took 2 steps back toward his SUV. I'm not part of this, he said, his hands raised. My group was only buying the frontage based on the title certificates provided by the Rutledge firm. If those certificates are fraudulent, our contract is null and void. Gavin, wait. Blake turned, but Ross was already inside his vehicle, the engine roaring as he backed out onto the highway, leaving a cloud of exhaust behind him. Chapter 8. The Cost of Clean Truth. Arthur Rutledge walked over to the desk. He didn't look at his son or his wife, who was now rolling down the window of the Lincoln, her face distorted by panic. He looked down at the blue ledger. He touched the leather with his thumb, a small, worn spot where his father's hand had rested 40 years before. We did it for the family, Brooke, Arthur said, his voice so quiet it was nearly lost in the wind. The town was dying. The factories were closing. If we didn't consolidate the land along the highway, some outside firm from Chicago would have bought it for nothing. We built the modern town. You built a cage, Dad, Brooke said. And you put everyone who wouldn't help you build it inside it. You put Uncle Marcus in his cabin. You put Old Man Miller out of business. And you tried to put me in a clerk's chair so I wouldn't look at the dirt you were standing on. What do you want? Blake snarled, his eyes wild as he looked around the apron at Tom Taylor, Finch, and the sheriff. Are you going to the newspapers? Are you going to destroy the firm? Everything we have, the house, the accounts, your sister's marriage, it's all tied to that commercial paper. I'm not doing anything to you, Blake, Brooke said, her voice entirely devoid of anger. The law is going to do it. Sheriff Vance is going to take these boxes to Judge Kent's house this afternoon. The state attorney's office will handle the tax restoration for the families who were foreclosed on. As for the strip mall, that land is mine. The leases will be transferred to my name by Monday morning. You'll ruin us, Eleanor said, having climbed out of the Lincoln, her heels sinking into the wet gravel. Her coat was open, her pearls swinging loose. You are a Rutledge, Brooke. You cannot drag your own mother into a public courtroom. You called me a hopeless failure 4 days ago, Mother, Brooke said, looking her in the eye for the first time. You said I chose the mud over the parlor. You were right. The mud is where the foundation is. And it's a lot cleaner than your parlor. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She turned and walked back to the car, her movements stiff and old, like a mechanical doll whose mainspring had run down. Arthur looked at Brooke for a long moment. He didn't ask for a copy of the deed. He didn't ask for a loan. He simply turned and followed his wife into the back seat of the Lincoln. Blake, Sheriff Vance said, his hand resting lightly on his brother Donald's shoulder. Let's go down to the station. We've got 40 years of paperwork to review, and I want to make sure none of it disappears between here and the courthouse. Blake looked at Brooke, his face twisted into an expression of pure, impotent rage. You'll never open this shop, Brooke. No one will ever buy gas from a traitor. They won't be buying gas, Blake, Brooke said, picking up her sledgehammer from the bench. They'll be buying service. Now get off my asphalt. Act 5, The New Ledger. Chapter 9, The Restoration. 6 months later, the intersection of Route 9 and the bypass didn't look like an eyesore anymore. The Texaco building had been entirely sandblasted, the old green and white paint replaced by a clean, clear sealant that let the texture of the post-war utility blocks show through, a solid, industrial gray that looked like it could withstand another century of winters. The rusted canopy had been straightened, its sheet metal skin replaced by a solar array that generated enough electricity to run the heavy commercial lifts Brooke had installed in both service bays. The vintage glass crown pumps had been restored, their interiors gutted to house high-speed charging terminals for electric vehicles, while the old underground tanks had been completely filled with inert concrete slurry. The office was now a bright, clean space with a large plate glass window that looked out over the hills. On the wall behind the counter hung the original 1982 survey map, framed in rough cedar wood that Uncle Marcus had cut from the reservoir lot. The strip mall next door had changed too. The national chain pharmacy had remained, but its lease payments were now deposited into an account titled the Silas Vance Vocational Trust, which funded apprenticeships for young mechanics and tradespeople in the valley. The first recipient of the scholarship was Sammy Green, who was currently working on the engine of a 1967 Mustang in Bay 1. It was a Saturday afternoon, and the property was busy. Mrs. Higgins' delivery van was parked out front, her staff carrying trays of sandwiches into the old office, which had been converted into a small cafe for drivers waiting on their vehicles. Tom Taylor was sitting on the wooden bench, talking to Mr. Finch about the new iron bracket they were forging for the town hall clock. Brooke stepped out of Bay 2, wiping her hands on a clean piece of cotton waste. She was wearing her usual blue canvas trousers and a gray shirt with Rutledge Restoration embroidered in small, white letters over the pocket. A car pulled up to the curb. It wasn't a Mercedes or a Lincoln, it was an old, well-maintained farm truck belonging to Uncle Marcus. He climbed out, carrying a small wooden sign he had carved from oak. "Where do you want this, Brooke?" he asked, holding it up. The sign read, "Value is found in the work." "Put it right over the main door, Uncle Marcus," Brooke said. As Marcus walked toward the tool room, a woman stepped out of the cafe section. It was Chloe. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a sweater, her hair tied back. She had left Charles Vane 3 months prior, after the disclosure of the family's tax records had triggered an audit of his investment firm's municipal bond accounts. She was currently living in a small cottage near the library, working as an assistant to Clara Davis. "Mother's selling the estate, Brooke," Chloe said, leaning against the side of the building. "The county took the carriage house for back taxes, and she can't afford the heating bill for the main house anymore. She's moving to an apartment in North Monmouth." "How is she?" Brooke asked. "She's quiet," Chloe said. "She spends a lot of time looking through old photo albums. She asked me yesterday if I had any drawings you did when you were a kid, the ones of the old tractors. I told her you kept them all in your toolbox." Brooke looked down at the cotton waste in her hands. "She can have them if she wants. And Blake, he's in the city," Chloe said, her voice dropping. "Working as an independent title researcher for a corporate title company. He doesn't go to the club anymore. I don't think he can afford the dues." Brooke didn't say anything. She didn't feel a surge of triumph or the warm glow of revenge. The truth hadn't been an act of cruelty, it had been an act of clearing, like removing a rotten sill plate from an old house so the rest of the structure wouldn't fall into the cellar. The sound of an air wrench echoed from the bay, a sharp, rhythmic whir tap-tap as Sammy tightened the lug nuts on a wheel. Sheriff Thomas Vance pulled onto the apron in his cruiser. He didn't get out, he just rolled down the window and tipped his hat to Brooke, A silent acknowledgement that the peace in Oak Ridge was now built on something real instead of a pile of stolen deeds in an iron safe. Brooke walked back into the service bay. The 1967 Mustang was resting on the heavy hydraulic lift, its red paint gleaming under the LED shop lights. She picked up a torque wrench, checked the specifications in her small black ledger, and went back to work. The station was hers. The ground was clear, and for the first time in 40 years, the numbers on the ledger matched the value of the dirt.